She never opened the letter, not once. For 30 years, it stayed in the same drawer, untouched, unread, and somehow unforgettable. Why would someone keep a sealed envelope for that long? What truth could be so heavy? It's easier never to know. In a quiet house at the edge of a forgotten village, an aging woman keeps a secret tucked away with the scent of old paper and lost time. No one asks, she never tells. But one evening, a voice from a flickering television reaches across decades, and something inside her shifts. Welcome to Echoes of Kindness. Come closer. There's a story in this silence that's been waiting to be heard. Let's begin. She lives alone now, has done for years. From the outside, Margaret's life is the kind people often pass without noticing. A stone cottage with ivy-covered walls, a wooden gate that squeaks in protest, and a garden where wildflowers bloom without permission. In her village, small, quiet, comfortably forgetful, she is the woman who used to run the library. Polite, reserved, always in cardigans, still drinks Earl Grey from the same teacup, chipped at the rim but never thrown away. What most people don't know is that Margaret hasn't moved the furniture in her bedroom since 1994. Not even once. The curtains are faded, the wallpaper peels in places, and the small oak dresser in the corner still holds a drawer she rarely opens, except to make sure the letter is still there. There's a kind of sadness that doesn't ask for attention. It simply settles into your bones like winter. Margaret wears her solitude the way others wear perfume. Lightly, but always. She is not bitter, nor is she broken, just unfinished. Years ago, before the gray streaked her hair and before silence became her closest companion, she was a girl who loved poetry and the smell of rain on old books. She worked in the village library and stayed long after closing time, shelving dreams other people had forgotten how to read. She believed in stories, in letters, in the kind of love that made you feel safe without ever raising its voice. And once, just once, she believed in someone. His name was Edward. He wasn't from the village. He arrived during the summer of '73, posted as part of a medical outreach before being stationed overseas. He borrowed books he didn't need, just to see her. He asked about Keats and let her speak uninterrupted. He listened, and not in the way people pretend to. They never made promises. Theirs was a quiet kind of courtship. Long walks, folded notes, glances held a second longer than necessary. But as war crept further into their future, so did silence. One day, Edward left. No goodbye. Only a letter, hand-delivered, never opened. And Margaret, she never asked why. Because not knowing meant hope could survive. Because once you read the last words, there's nothing left to wait for. Over the years, neighbors married, moved, returned with grandchildren. Margaret stayed, not out of duty, but because the house held echoes of moments too fragile to move. She kept his books on the shelf, dusted them every spring. She told herself she was content, that it had been too brief to matter, that letting go was simply practical. But sometimes on rainy afternoons, she would stand at the foot of the stairs, eyes fixed on that second drawer, heart caught in a memory not yet spoken aloud. There was no vow, no ring, just an unfinished sentence in her heart that whispered every night before sleep. If he ever asks again, I'll say yes. Not out loud, never out loud. Some answers are folded into the silence, waiting like a letter in a drawer. It began on an ordinary Tuesday. The kind of day that blends quietly into all the others, gray skies, light drizzle, the radio mumbling in the kitchen. Margaret had just finished feeding the birds, wiping the window pane as a robin fluttered off the sill. She turned on the kettle, reached for her tin of loose-leaf Earl Grey, and out of habit more than intention, flicked the television on. She rarely watched it, just background noise, something to keep the silence from feeling too sharp. Most days it played cooking shows or old gardening programs, but that afternoon something was different. A voice, gentle, male, slightly weathered, filled the room, accompanied by the low hum of strings. Margaret paused. The program was a documentary, the kind that aired quietly in the middle of the week. Letters from the past, British medics, remember Vietnam. On screen, a grainy shot showed rice paddies under monsoon skies. A camera swept slowly across a group of elderly men standing beside a weathered monument. their expressions distant, heavy with memory. The narrator spoke of service, of loss, of unsent letters, and years that could not be reclaimed. Margaret turned to switch the channel, but then something stopped her. One of the men was speaking now, not to the camera, but seemingly to the air around him. His accent was Southern English, soft and clear despite the years. She loved poetry, he said, eyes not on the lens but on something far beyond. When it rained, she always read Keats aloud, said it made the world feel gentler. Margaret's heart stilled. No one else had ever known that, not the way he said it, not as a detail, but as a memory so vivid it hurt. Her hand slipped from the remote. For a moment, the room was silent except for the whistle of the kettle, shrill and rising. She didn't hear it. She was already moving, slow at first, then faster, across the hall, up the stairs, to the bedroom that still carried the faint scent of lavender and old wood. The second drawer of the oak dresser creaked as she opened it. Her hands trembled, hovering above the contents like a pianist afraid of the first note. There it was, still wrapped in the same faded blue ribbon, still sealed, still waiting. For 30 years, Margaret had opened that drawer without opening the letter. But now the memory of that voice, his voice, had split something open inside her. The words on the screen weren't coincidence. They couldn't be. She sat on the edge of her bed, Salman, the letter in her lap. For a long time, she simply looked at it. She ran her fingers over the parchment, feeling the slight ridge where the seal held. She thought of the rain outside, of Keats, of the quiet way Edward used to look at her, not like he was trying to possess her, but like he was trying to remember her forever. Then, with a breath that shook through her shoulders, she undid the ribbon. The seal broke with a soft snap. The paper crackled like something waking up. The letter was written in blue ink, just slightly faded. Not long, not dramatic, but the words were enough to unravel everything she'd taught herself to forget. If I survive, I'll return. If I don't, this letter is the only way I could ask, would you have married me? There was no goodbye, no finality, only a question left suspended in time, waiting for an answer that never came. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest. She didn't cry right away. That came later, in waves, unexpected, uncontained. But in that first moment, what she felt was something quieter, a loosening, as though she'd been holding her breath for decades without realizing it. Downstairs, the documentary played on. The credits rolled, mentioning the name of a charitable trust that had helped bring the veterans together for the filming. Margaret scribbled it down on the back of a grocery receipt. Her fingers were still shaking. She wasn't entirely sure what she was doing, only that she had to do something. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she sat by the window, the letter resting beside her teacup, watching as the wind stirred the garden below. She thought of the life she might have had, the one she'd quietly folded away, along with the letter, because no one had ever told her otherwise. But now she knew. It hadn't been a goodbye. It had been a beginning that never had the chance to begin. The following morning, Margaret phoned the number listed in the credits. A woman answered, kind and efficient, and listened patiently as Margaret, in a voice steadier than she expected, explained that she believed one of the men featured in the program had once written her a letter. A very long time ago. There was a pause. Then the woman said gently, "We might be able to help." And just like that, the air around Margaret shifted. It wasn't dramatic, no lightning, no music, just the quiet certainty that life, even after 30 years of silence, still had another chapter left to write. She returned the letter to its place in the drawer, not out of habit, but as a promise. Not all answers come quickly. Some are decades in the making. But once they arrive, even if they arrive on a quiet Tuesday in March, they ask something of you. They ask, what now? And for the first time in 30 years, Margaret was ready to find out. It had been a week since Margaret made the call. 7 long days suspended between hope and hesitation. She'd given the woman her name, the year Edward left, even described the way he used to hum under his breath when he was reading, and then waited. The woman from the trust, Claire, had promised to look into it. She'd said kindly, "These things take time, but I'll be in touch." Margaret had nodded, though Claire couldn't see her. After she hung up, she'd stared at the phone for a long while, as though the voice on the other end might come back if she simply stayed still enough. The days that followed moved strangely. Part of her went about things as she always had. She swept the leaves off the porch, refilled the bird feeder, returned her library books. But something in the air had shifted. Her home, once a quiet cocoon of solitude, now buzzed with questions. At night, sleep refused to come easily. She found herself replaying old moments she hadn't dared to remember for years. Edward's laugh, soft and unsure, as though surprised by his own joy. The way he'd held his tea with both hands, as if afraid it might slip through his fingers. The last afternoon they spent together in the reading room, with rain tapping on the window panes and the world for a moment, feeling safe. She wondered what had stopped him. Had he been hurt? Had he tried to write again? Had she missed a sign? And the hardest question of all, if he had returned, would she still have been the same woman he once asked to wait for him? One morning a letter arrived. Not the letter, but a new one with a crisp white envelope and her name printed in careful ink. No return address. Her fingers trembled as she slid her nail beneath the seal. Inside it was a single sheet, typed. Claire had written, "We believe we've found him. He's living in Cambridgeshire, near Ely. Works part-time at a community health clinic. Never married. No known children. Would you like us to arrange contact?" Margaret read the words again and again. Her chest felt tight. Joy didn't rush in the way she'd imagined. Instead, it crept in cautiously, like light beneath a closed door. There was no clear instruction, no sudden clarity, just one impossible truth. Edward was still alive. She set the letter down. Her hands, now resting in her lap, felt unfamiliar, as if they belonged to a younger version of herself who hadn't yet learned how to wait. She felt as though time itself had folded, placing the past and present too close together to breathe properly. What if she saw him and he didn't remember? What if the man she knew had been lost somewhere inside the man who remained? What if this stirred up something neither of them could carry anymore? The days stretched on. Margaret walked more now, often along the edge of the village where the fields opened into soft hills, hoping the rhythm of her steps might still her thoughts. But each walk only deepened the ache. It wasn't just about Edward. It was about all the versions of herself she had buried to survive the silence. The young woman who read Keats aloud to the rain. The librarian who once believed that words could mend what life broke. The quiet girl who never said goodbye. When Claire called again, Margaret answered on the first ring. "He's willing to meet," Claire said gently, "but only if you feel ready." Ready. Was she? "I don't know," Margaret whispered. Then after a pause, "Yes, I think I've waited long enough." They agreed on a public place, a park near Edward's town. Quiet, open, no pressure. Margaret would bring the letter. Claire offered to accompany her, but Margaret declined. In the days leading up to it, something curious began to happen. The villagers, those who'd always greeted her with polite smiles but little else, started noticing her more. Mrs. Elkins from the bakery asked if she was going somewhere nice, spotting the new coat Margaret had finally taken out from the wardrobe. The postman lingered a little longer at the gate, asking if she'd seen the snowdrops blooming near the churchyard. It was as if her quiet was softening, inviting others in, and yet doubt remained. On the morning of the meeting, Margaret sat at her dressing table staring at her reflection. She wore the pearl brooch Edward had once complimented, back when compliments had felt rare and precious. Her hands, still steady, smoothed the collar of her blouse. She felt like both the woman she had become and the girl she used to be. Neither fully whole, both still waiting. Before she left, she opened the drawer one last time. The letter by him, the old one, now lay beside a small photograph of them taken at the village fete. She tucked both into her handbag, and then quietly, she stepped out into the day. The park was almost empty when she arrived. A light breeze stirred the early spring leaves, and a bench under an old beech tree waited, dappled with sunlight. She sat, waited. Her heart beat slower than she expected. When Edward appeared, she recognized him instantly. Not by his face, which time had gently altered, but by the way he walked, deliberate, thoughtful, as if listening to the world. He paused when he saw her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly he came closer. "Hello, Margaret," he said. His voice still held the shape of her name. She opened her bag, took out the letter, not the new one, but the old one, the one that had never left her drawer. She held it out to him with both hands. and said the words she'd rehearsed 1,000 times, though none of them ever felt quite right. My answer, she said, was always yes. Edward took the letter with both hands, but he didn't look at it straight away. Instead, he looked at her, really looked, and for a moment, time did something strange. It folded again, the years collapsing between them like pages turning too quickly. His eyes, still that same blue-gray, though softer now, dimmed slightly by age, searched her face for something familiar. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly. Margaret offered a small smile. Neither was I. Edward sat beside her on the bench, not too close, not too far. The space between them held a lifetime. "I almost didn't send it," he said, nodding toward the letter. "But I couldn't leave without trying." She turned toward him. "Why didn't you come back?" He inhaled, the breath catching in his throat. "I did." Margaret froze. He continued, voice low, as though confessing something fragile. "I came back 3 years later. Not right away. I was injured in Hanoi, ended up working in a refugee camp after the armistice. When I finally returned, I went straight to your cottage." She stared, stunned. "You weren't there. An older couple answered the door, said you'd moved, said they didn't know where." Her heart pounded. She remembered vaguely the 6 months she'd left the village to care for a dying aunt in Bath. Her parents had sold the house during that time. By the time she returned, she had little energy to start over. And she'd assumed, "I thought you never came," she whispered. "I thought you didn't wait," he replied. The silence between them became heavier, not cold, but aching. Two lives, stretched apart by a single missed moment. "I looked for you," he added. "Not hard enough, perhaps. I should have tried harder." Margaret shook her head. "No, I buried the past. I didn't let myself believe it was still alive." They sat in the hush of spring, birds weaving in and out of the branches above them. Edward finally opened the letter. He read it slowly, his hands trembling just slightly. When he reached the end, he closed his eyes. "I remember writing this," he said. "I remember hoping it might be enough." Margaret looked down. "For a long time, I thought it was a goodbye." "It wasn't," he said. "It was a beginning, one I didn't know how to finish." They didn't speak for a while. The park carried on around them, a child chasing a dog in the distance, wind stirring the petals of an early blooming magnolia. Life going on. Edward turned to her. "I kept something too." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a faded photograph. It was small and creased, edges soft with age. It showed Margaret, much younger, standing in front of the library, holding a book to her chest, laughing at something unseen. "I carried this with me, everywhere, swaying, even when it hurt to look at." Her breath caught. She didn't remember anyone taking that picture, but she remembered the dress, the hair clip, even the feeling of sunlight on her face that day. "I wasn't brave," he said, "not then. I let the silence win." Margaret looked at the photograph, then at Edward. He seemed smaller now, not in stature, but in the way sorrow shapes a person. She recognized the strength in him, but also the regret, and she felt her own too. "I didn't open your letter because I was afraid of what it would take from me," she said. "I thought if I never opened it, I could keep you, just as I remembered." Edward nodded. "I understand." And he did. That was the hardest part. Not that time had passed, but that in many ways they still understood each other. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what might have happened?" She smiled softly. "I used to, but lately I've started wondering what still could." The twist wasn't dramatic. No grand reveal, just a simple, painful truth. Both had returned, both had looked, and both had missed each other by inches. The tragedy wasn't betrayal, it was almost. But now, finally, they sat side by side, not to make up for lost time, but to honor it. Edward folded the letter again, more carefully this time. "What now?" he asked. Margaret looked at the bench, the park, the long path that wound past the beech trees and out into the open field. "I don't know," she said, "but maybe we start with a walk." He smiled, and so they rose, slowly, tentatively, and walked together, not towards the past, not away from it, but into whatever still waited for them, side by side. And for the first time in 30 years, neither of them looked back. The path curved gently around the edge of the park, where the grass gave way to open fields and distant cottages. Margaret and Edward walked slowly, their steps unhurried, as though neither of them wanted the moment to end. There was no need for grand speeches, no promises, just the quiet rhythm of two people relearning how to exist beside one another. As they walked, they talked, not of the missing years, not yet, but of the ordinary things. The birds returning for spring. The old library building, now a community center, the best spot in the village for scones. Each word was a thread, gently stitching together the torn edges of memory. In the weeks that followed, they met often. Not every day. There was still caution, still the unfamiliar terrain of this new version of them. But enough. Sometimes at the park, sometimes in Margaret's garden. He would bring flowers from the market. She would make tea. They read together again. Not aloud at first, but side by side. Until one afternoon, just as the rain began to tap against the conservatory roof, Margaret reached for a worn volume of Keats and without thinking read, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." Edward smiled without looking at her. "I'd almost forgotten that line," he said, "but not your voice." There were moments when the ache returned, soft and sudden, like a distant echo. Regrets don't vanish, not really, but they lost their sting when shared. And slowly, without either of them saying it aloud, a life began to bloom in the spaces where sorrow had once settled. Not a second chance, not quite, but a continuation. Margaret no longer walked with her head down. Neighbors noticed. The woman at the bakery asked if she'd changed her hair. The postman brought clippings of local poetry readings. Even the sparrows in her garden seemed to linger longer. One morning she returned to the drawer. The letter was no longer alone. Beside it now was a second envelope, not sealed, just resting. Inside, a new letter. Her own words. Written not in reply but in reflection. Not for Edward, not even for herself, but for the version of her that had waited so long without knowing what for. She folded it gently, placed it next to his, and closed the drawer. Some stories aren't meant to be rewritten, only resumed. She had once believed love, to be real, needed to be loud, sweeping gestures, clear beginnings. But now she understood. Real love was often quiet. It waited, not out of weakness, but out of strength. And sometimes the kindest thing we can do is forgive the silence, in others and in ourselves. One evening, as the sky turned the color of old lilac, Edward and Margaret sat on the garden bench, the kettle still warm inside, a book resting open between them. "I'm glad you opened the letter," he said. She looked at him, a gentle smile forming. "So am I." Then after a pause, "But I'm even more glad I didn't let it end there." A breeze moved through the garden, lifting the edges of the pages. Somewhere nearby, a blackbird began to sing. And in that small, unremarkable moment, the kind life often hides in plain sight, there was peace, not the peace of resolution, but of understanding, of something lost being found again, in a form neither of them had expected, but both had longed for. Sometimes love doesn't end, it just waits. Quietly, patiently, like a letter in a drawer. Maybe you've kept a drawer closed for too long too. If this story stirred something in you, even just a little, comment 1 so we know we're not alone in waiting. And if you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to the channel for more. Don't forget to check out the video currently on your screen. You won't want to miss it. See you in the next one.